Hello and welcome to Kickback Science Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Luke. This podcast is your place to get the tools and knowledge necessary to navigate the world of health and wellness. So kick back, let's talk science. This is good content. This stuff has gone crazy. We'll jump into it. Let's dive in. Let's do a little science. I'm going nitty gritty science right now.
I've been looking forward to this.
Kind of going on a little bit of a tangent. Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. The information we discuss in this podcast is not meant to be taken as medical advice. It is simply informative. We're not affiliated with any organization or institution, just a few guys talking science and having fun.
All right, welcome back, everybody.
What's up, guys? I missed you.
Joe, nice seeing you.
Thanks. Nice seeing you, too.
I wish the audience could see you.
It's all right. I'm not that good looking.
We should just post a picture of you, like a still in the mic.
Yeah.
It just pops up.
Yeah, dude.
Every time that you talk.
You know, though, see that dog in the background of that video? That's Kato.
Dude.
We should probably introduce Kato. That's Luke's dog.
Oh,
He's
we will.
majestic. Look at him.
Would you just
Dude,
look
yeah,
at
look in Reed's
Video? Yeah.
video.
Epic.
Look at him.
That's my dude.
Yeah, he's a good dog.
Yeah, he's the reason that I am able to get so much science in my life.
Yeah.
We go on walks and we just listen and talk science
He's got one
all
of those
day.
He's got one of those little talkers, you know, like have you seen that? Like in the movie Up?
Oh, yep.
But he's not saying squirrel, he's talking PhD level stuff.
Dad, did you know they made these nutritional claims with observational data and reported causation? How ridiculous.
Let's dive in deep.
Let's dive in deep, baby. You know, I just noticed you didn't say that in the last.
I've been trying to limit myself to
It's
the
all right,
diets,
you
but
know.
I might bring it back.
Reed gets one dive in deep per episode. And then you got to do the audience clap. And if he does two, do
dive
that.
All right, today we're back with another battle of the diets. Today we're going to be talking about flexible dieting and, drum roll please, vegetarian diet. Ooh, hey now.
Vegetarian. So vegans, but you can drink that milk.
I kind of have a hunch who's going to win this one, but let's see if
you were wrong about.
Yeah, I was wrong about the other one.
The other ones.
Yeah. Audience, what do you guys think? Who are we going to pick?
I don't know. So far, we've got
Joe says, I don't know.
Vegan.
My guess is going to be the flexible dieting, but we'll see how.
I think so too.
Episode, but
I think so too.
We'll see. But Luke, can you kind of just dive in deeper into each one?
Oh, used it right away.
All right.
All right, let's dive in deep. So when we're talking these two diets, so vegetarian versus flexible dieting, if you haven't listened to the vegan versus carnivore one yet, give that a listen. You don't have to listen before this one for any reason, but we do kind of talk about the benefits, harms of plants. We're going to talk a little bit about that in this one too. But what differentiates vegetarian to vegan is vegetarians can have animal products. They just cannot have meat. And so dairy consumption, some vegetarians will eat eggs as well, but just no meat intake. And flexible dieting is you focus on calories in, calories out. So it's that energy in versus energy out. And then you focus on macronutrients, so carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And it's going to be different for everybody, but you just focus on hitting your daily target in those. It doesn't really necessarily matter how you get to those. Some people will tend to follow a more whole food and healthier diet approach rather than processed meals to get them there. But that's not really what flexible dieting is. It's making sure you hit your target calorie intake and hit your macronutrients. And so it's more flexible, hence the name, flexible dieting.
So we're going with vegetarian first, or are we going flexible dieting first?
What do you guys want to start with?
Yeah, who wants to start the battle? Let's start with vegetarian.
Okay,
let's do it.
Yeah,
bring it on, Reed.
What do we want to know? What do we want to know with vegetarian?
So it differs from vegan because you can actually have animal products, like eggs and dairy and stuff like that. So what are I guess that would be a battle between vegan and vegetarian, so I don't want to touch up on that yet.
Yeah, if you were about to hit on dairy, go ahead, listen to the vegan podcast. We talk a ton about, is dairy actually bad for you? and we summarize that. Now, when we're talking vegetarian, though, the reasons people do it is similar to vegans in terms of like either it has, one, an impact on my health, two, an impact on the environment, or three, the ethical reasons of not wanting to eat meat because of the animal. And I feel like people went vegetarian.
There's also some people like my cousin who just doesn't like the taste of meat.
Sure. Okay. Yep.
I'm going to throw that out there.
Yeah. If you just don't like meat in general, then obviously you're not going to eat something that you do not enjoy. But I imagine that's a low percentage.
Yeah. I mean, I was just touching on that just in case.
When you talk about a diet that is no meat, it has to come from the idea that meat is bad for you, right? If you're getting rid of something, if you're restricting something, it is because you have this notion that is bad for your health. And this is when we're talking just health in general, because we are not going to touch on the environment. We're not going to touch on the ethics of it. We're going to focus on health specifically. And the evidence against meat gets so hyped up in the media, like more than anything, it seems, where people are just talking like, oh, red meat causes cancer. You hear that all the time, like, oh, limit red meat consumption. And the like documentaries on Netflix, it started with Game Changers, blew up like crazy, where it was the documentary's premise, along with like political things of the environment, was talking about how meat's so harmful for you. One of the studies that they talked about in that documentary was this study from 1998. This got really popular because they looked at a group of people which were called their Seventh-day Adventists. It's a church organization that the church members typically do not eat meat products. They follow a vegetarian diet. And so these group of researchers went and studied these individuals, and 30% of the church members did adhere to a strict vegetarian diet. So they were already vegetarian, and then looked at the other church goers that did not adhere to the vegetarians. You've got a similar community of people, and you can assess different diets within them. Not super well controlled, but I mean, it's a start. And they found after 6 years of following that they had a 85% increase in mortality of cardiovascular disease if they ate meat. So, I mean, 85%, that is huge, right? So this blew up. Now, what's hilarious, and you see this time and time again in this research, is they reported what's called relative risk. So the difference between relative risk and absolute risk is relative. You're just comparing it relative to the other group. And so to put that in perspective, let's say we took 100 people and we found that 2 of them in the meat eating group died of cardiovascular disease. So that is 2% of people died of cardiovascular disease. And then in the vegetarian group, and this isn't the data that they did, I'm just giving this as an example. And then let's say the vegetarian group, only 1 person died of cardiovascular disease. That's a 1%. If you compare relative difference, you can say, oh, there's a 50% reduction in cardiovascular disease from people who eat vegetables versus meat. When in reality, so that's the relative risk, would be 50%. The absolute risk, when you compare 2 to 1, that is a 1% difference. There is 1% difference between those two, from 2 to 1. And so people fail to report absolute risk when they are trying to just publish some interesting finding that they hope is interesting to people, and like not actually true data interpretation and true scientific findings. When you look at the absolute risk reduction, so again, relative, it was an 85% increase in mortality if you have meat. Bah, 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 bah. People went crazy, and Game Changers highlighted this study. You look at the absolute risk, guess what it is?
Any guesses, Joe?
I'm going to go 7%.
7%, Reed, you got a guess?
1, Bob.
1? It was less than 1. It was less than 0.2%. 0.16%.
How are you going to be able to say 85%? That's stupid.
Yeah. Well, because you can. You can
well,
say
I know
right.
you can, but
but you shouldn't.
Right.
Yeah.
There's just false information.
So there is absolutely no difference between vegetarian and meat eating in this population, but instead we decide to blow it up and say, oh, red meat causes death.
They probably also had the churchgoers, when they do those exorcisms. Bet you anything.
What's also really funny, I have no idea what you just said. So even when you look even further,
Next podcast, exorcisms.
oh, that's great. So when you look even further, so if that's not already ridiculous enough, which again, I want to say this happens so often. Another thing that happens really often in nutritional research that is clearly just observational. You just observe two populations. There's nothing controlled and randomized in these. They fail to address what are called confounding variables. And we talked a little bit about this in the vegan episode. A confounding variable is some other aspect of your life that could influence the outcome being measured. So cardiovascular disease. So other things that would impact it, not just meat, would be how active are you? Do you smoke cigarettes? Do you have a family history of this disease? Do you have high blood pressure? Are you on medications? All these things have an influence on that. And people fail to highlight, okay, what was studies do a really good job of making sure people do try to address that as much as possible. But in this particular study, when you look further into the different groups, people that are vegetarian, again, and I shouldn't say again because we haven't talked about it in this podcast, but in the vegan one, I talked about healthy user bias. People that are vegetarian are intentionally vegetarian for aspects of their health, not just getting rid of meat. They tend to exercise more. They tend to be health conscious in other ways. And so when you compare the two populations, the church members that were vegetarian versus meat eating, less than 1% of the vegetarians smoked cigarettes compared to 7% in the non-vegetarians. Less than 1% drank alcohol compared to 9%. And they were more physically active than the meat-eating population. And there were other differences as well, but I could find plenty of studies that explain that difference alone caused any difference we saw, which again was only a 0.16%, which is not statistically significant. So yeah, I mean, that's where it all started with that 1998 study. I shouldn't say that's where it all started. I mean, people have been observing different ideas of eating plants versus eating meat for a while, but it is not consistent. It's all over the place. And that's the problem with nutritional research is in order to find if something has causality, so if something causes something, you have to do multiple blinded, randomized, controlled trials. And it's hard to do that in nutrition. So they do what are called these observational studies where they just look at different populations and they compare them and say, oh, vegetarians were healthier here, therefore meat causes cancer. And that's what's done time and time again. And that's not even consistently found. I can find plenty of papers that suggest an increased meat intake. And there are papers actually that have looked. There was one with 1,000 individuals in Italy that looked the higher meat consumption they had, the healthier they were. So it goes both ways, I'll get off my soapbox.
So do we have any deficiencies that we see with going vegetarian?
So going vegetarian, the risks that come about with it have to do with protein intake. And again, we touch a lot about this in the vegan podcast of plant-based proteins tend to be short of what are called essential amino acids. And essential amino acids, your body is not able to produce on its own, so it requires them from your diet. When you get a plant-based protein, you have lower of those versus meat, which has a higher amount. So you tend to need more plant-based protein. And then in addition to that, when you're eating the plant itself, most of that protein is bound up in this fibrous material that your body's got to break down in order to absorb. So you absorb less protein from plants as you do from meat. So you got to increase about 10 to 20% the protein that you're actually eating in order to know that it's going to get into your bloodstream. The There are studies that show that when you take plant protein versus meat protein, you have differing levels of circulating amino acids, showing that meat increases amino acid circulation. And people that eat the recommended amount of plant-based protein, recommended being 0.8 grams per kilogram, which again, we talked a little bit about in the other podcast of that is the minimum amount of protein you can have. Okay. That it definitely needs to be more than that. But if you have that amount in a vegetarian diet, plant-based protein, you're in a nitrogen deficit or a negative nitrogen balance, I should say. So there's a paper that showed that if you consume protein, which is the only thing that you consume that has nitrogen, and you measure how much of that nitrogen gets used for building muscle tissue versus how much is excreted from your body breaking down muscle tissue, people that had this vegan diet that was the recommended amount of protein, and the researchers actually gave the participants this plant-based protein, so they supplied it for them so they knew they were taking it in. They were in this negative nitrogen balance, meaning they were getting rid of more nitrogen than they were utilizing, so they were breaking down muscle. And so you're at a deficiency in protein unless you supplement with the proper protein. And certain proteins like soy is short on leucine. Leucine is an essential amino acid that stimulates your body to go through protein synthesis. It activates what's called mTOR, mechanistic target of rapamycin. That is involved in your cell's ability to grow, to go through muscle protein synthesis. And so you need to get other types of protein, soy, corn, wheat, and blend them in order to meet that amino acid composition. And again, we talk about this in the other podcasts as well. And there are papers that show having a blend, if you get enough protein, plant-based protein, if you can increase it enough, you can get that level of protein synthesis. You can build muscle. But if you don't get enough protein, you in your vegetarian diet, it's common to not get enough protein.
But you can eat eggs and milk and yogurt, so that will supplement that a lot. So you'll actually see a higher protein intake with vegetarian
versus vegans.
Yeah, it'll be a lot easier to get that.
Right?
No,
is there any
I'm pretty sure there's also a strict vegetarian where they will not eat eggs.
Yeah, that does exist.
So there is that.
Yeah,
but there are vegetarians that do.
Yeah, and so they have an advantage of getting the protein from eggs. But the strict vegetarian, they're going to have to supplement.
Is there any difference between egg protein, like protein from eggs compared to protein from meat? Or are you seeing the same benefits?
The composition of protein from egg versus meat is similar. It's the plant protein specifically that is deficient in those essential amino acids. And the ability to break it down and absorb it. Because you can absorb egg protein better than you can absorb plant protein. And like the stuff that has gotten so popular is just all these studies that are so anti-meat. Like, how many times have you heard, like, don't eat red meat? It causes cancer, and, limit your red meat consumption. And
it'll cause pancreatic cancer or,
heart disease.
Yeah, heart disease.
I mean, you hear that all the time.
Yeah.
And, like, that idea got blown up in 2012 from there's this lab. It's at Harvard. It's a public health lab that has put out these articles that they seem to be the ones contributing a large amount to this idea of red meat consumption and the risk on cancer. And when you look at like the author of one of the papers that we'll talk about in a second from 2012, he gets invited to speak at vegetarian conferences all the time, and he's an editor on for a journal that's heavily involved in vegetarian diet promotion. And not to say that people don't have conflict of interest, that's very normal, but you got to take these things into consideration, like potential conflict of interest. And in this paper that was all over. So this was in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, CNN, ABC, everywhere in 2012. And that's when we started hearing red meat causes cancer. And it was because of this one article published that was basically a summary of a couple different observational studies showing that people who had more red meat tended to have a greater risk of cancer. And really mortality was the main thing here. Mortality being just death from any disease as opposed to like accidental deaths. They wouldn't report that, but it said that red meat caused these things. And again, that's the causation that is so false. You cannot say it caused anything here. First of all, even if it did cause something, like what is the percentage? Remember when we talked about absolute versus relative risk? Now, in this paper, they found that less than 1 out of 100 people ended up dying of any sort of disease. So there was less than 1 out of 100 risk of mortality in people that had higher meat consumption. That is nothing. And that was for like 28 years that the span of this study was. And what they did, when you look further in the study, they cherry-picked meat to say it was meat that caused this, and they failed to talk about things like low physical activity, BMI. That also showed an even greater risk of mortality than the meat. But no, instead we're going to write this article from Harvard. Of course, everyone is like, oh, Harvard came out with it, therefore it is true. And then the media just blew it up and said it caused it. And what this is a classic method of just very poor science just for publicity. Because what they're doing, they are not practicing the proper scientific method. They are forming a hypothesis first, or they're not forming their hypothesis. They are forming a conclusion and then going back into the data till they find it. And what you are supposed to do, what you need to do to show any evidence of anything is you have a hypothesis, you form a question, and you try to prove that wrong. Once you cannot prove your own hypothesis wrong, you can therefore say there is evidence to support it. So you're trying to prove yourself wrong in a lab. You're not trying to say, okay, what can we find that proves ourselves right? That is the opposite of science. And that's what they did here. And this got so blown up. And
then they know the general public's not going to go searching for the answer. They're going to be like you said, oh, this is Harvard.
Yeah, they'll take that.
I'm going with that and running with it. I'm going vegetarian.
Yeah. And you know what's hilarious? So this is crazy. So that paper comes out 2012, right? And you've got these authors that are getting articles written about them. They're getting on the news. Everyone's talking about it. And again, you hear people talking about the effects of this one article saying, don't eat red meat. It's going to kill you. And you still hear people talk about it. Well, there was a group, and this was from 14 different companies or countries, a ton of different researchers, a ton of different labs, a ton of different editors went together and just bulked all the research on meat consumption, specifically red meat, and what does it do for your risk of mortality. And this was a few years ago where they were like, okay, these are some bold claims. The science is horrible. What do the data actually tell us? So there's 5 different very, very rigorous papers that were put out, reviews of randomized controlled trials, like a ton of meta-analyses saying, where are we at with the data? And they came to the conclusion there is no risk of mortality from meat consumption based on where the data are at right now, and put out these papers. And yep, news is you can eat your meat, right? Well, as soon as those labs found out, they bombarded this poor chief editor of this journal. So it got published in the Annals of Internal Medicine. And the poor editor of that journal, who releases the science to the community so we can read it, she got bombarded to where her inbox shut down. She was interviewed and said there was over 2,000 emails immediately from people saying that needs to be revoked right now, trying to bring it down. She said, and this is a quote from an interview that she did. Well, I'm not going to quote it. Actually, I'm going to summarize it because I don't have the quote right in front of me. But we'll link to the actual article where you can see it. She talked about how like their journal specifically has published evidence suggesting, like increase ownership of guns causes this for deaths and suicides and all this. Basically, like the risks of guns. And the response she's gotten from the NRA, she said, was nothing compared to the response that she got from people wanting a plant-based diet when someone came out with an article saying there's a lack of evidence suggesting meat is harmful. And And this problem, so the person who led it, they actually released the email that this guy, Dr. Katz, he's from the Total Health Initiative. He's the one who wrote one email in particular that got a bunch of signatures from all these other scientists that were like, we feel that the science has been violated, and them saying that red meat consumption is not harmful is a disservice to society, and blah, blah, blah. When, like, in reality, it's just in addition to the evidence that we have. And that person, you actually can see his email. We'll post to that too. It's like the original email, and is just trying to just make sure that they don't let anyone see this paper. And he's got ties. So the Total Health Initiative is, they have ties to so many different corporations that profit from a decrease in meat consumption. And I say all that to say, this goes both ways. When you watch these documentaries on Netflix about like, the people profit from the meat consumption and the meat industry is funding all this stuff and blah, blah, blah.
Every time you eat meat, there's a puff of smoke in Amazon. That was another thing. And so I was like, what?
Well, and it's really like the people that fund both these agendas are on both sides, and they're both as corrupt as each other. And so for people to sit here and bash on meat consumption, and it's just, the problem that I have is the people that are doing this are some of the best scientists in the world. So Harvard came out with another paper. That same public health lab came out with a paper after these group of papers were released saying that there's no risk, and was like, well, this paper said there was no risk, but we feel that there is, and like was basically trying to get people to like continue to believe that research is not true, but their research is true, even though it's
and they didn't send any research with their email.
Yeah, well, it was a post about, yeah. But it's like, these are very well-respected scientists in the community, and who deals with all this? It's the public. People that are thinking that, oh, this is a credible source, I got to get rid of red meat now. And they go to these restricted diets, like a vegetarian diet. That's hard for people. Some people do really well on a vegetarian diet, and I'm not sitting here and telling you not to go on a vegetarian diet. If you respond well, do it. Please do it. Do not refrain from going on a vegetarian diet just because if you think I'm saying anything against it, I'm not. But people will try it thinking it is the right way to eat, and they will restrict something that is might be important in their day-to-day lives, and that is meat consumption. That might be really hard for them. And then they fall right back into this poor eating habit. And that's where we kind of get into flexible dieting. I'll touch on that a little bit after we finish vegetarian. But you don't want to sit here and say that is the right way to eat for everybody. That is such a horrible claim to make, because the evidence is not there at all. And again, however you eat, if you respond well to it, do it. I'm not sitting here telling you eat all red meat, and I'm not sitting here telling you only eat plants. But I just cannot stand these professionals in the field that are so worried about their own reputations and profit, and that it has an impact on the rest of society. It is that is not science. That's politics.
And we're not talking politics.
No, we ain't.
Brain. So we just talked about the cons of it, now let's talk about like the pros for going vegetarian. Like, what are all the benefits that you see if you switch to vegetarian, if this fits for your diet?
Yeah. So there are, countless studies that suggest an increase in vegetable intake is beneficial for your health. There's one particular study that grouped people into just high versus low vegetable intake, whether or not they ate meat or not. And this is true across the board. You tend to see a greater increase in vegetable intake and a greater health. And so we know, okay, eating more vegetables is healthy for you. And this comes from a lot of research suggesting that a component of vegetables called phytochemicals. These phytochemicals, they're very heavily studied in animal studies, but they're a component of the plant that has shown to decrease risk of cardiovascular disease. And again, most of the research is done in animals. We don't have a ton in humans, but we can say pretty confidently that fruits and vegetables are beneficial for your health overall.
And will you see weight loss as well in vegetarian diet?
Yeah, oftentimes you'll see pretty significant weight loss. And when you look at the papers that show like vegetarian diets and what happens to weight, a bulk of that is, well, I shouldn't say a bulk of it, it's coming from caloric restriction. You're restricting certain aspects of your diet, and eating less food, you're dropping weight. So it comes down to a difference in calorie intake. And vegetarian diet's a great way to reduce day-to-day calories and lose weight.
And then how about resistance training? Because that's a big focus for me. Is like, is this going to decrease my muscle growth going vegetarian, or am I still going to see the same gains if I was doing an omnivore diet? Or
yeah, there's a cool paper where they looked at, because people get all into like, oh, you're vegetarian, you're not getting enough protein, and a lot of people aren't. But there's a paper where they did provide individuals with 1.6 grams per kilogram of protein with either an animal-based protein or plant-based protein. And as long as you met that protein intake, so if protein was controlled across the board, there was no difference in the plant-based protein and what it did to 1 rep max and muscle protein synthesis.
So that protein, was that from a supplement?
Yep. And that's actually a really, really good question, because when you look back at the methods of the paper and the outcomes they reported, the participants in the animal-based protein, they didn't have to supplement to hit that 1.6 grams per kilogram, but the vegetarian participants did have to supplement. And when they did supplement, they supplemented with a blend of plant-based protein. So not just corn protein, not just pea protein, not just soy protein.
So like a powder.
It is a powder, but it's a blend of those powders, because certain proteins are deficient in certain amino acids.
Differently in the body.
They just have different composition to them.
Okay. Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, you could still gain muscle. You can still have just as much protein synthesis as long as you're getting proper calorie intake and you hit sufficient protein.
I mean, the average person doing a vegetarian diet probably doesn't know that, right?
And that's the problem.
So probably are deficient in protein.
Many people are. And yeah, so you do want to be very intentional about your protein intake if you decide to go plant-based.
Like, do your research, figure out.
Yep. What is your recommended daily intake? And know that the amount that you see on a nutrition label for a plant, you're not actually going to absorb that amount of protein, and you're going to absorb less of it versus a animal-based protein, because your body has to break down and access that protein through the different fibrous components of the plant that all that protein's wrapped up in.
Nice.
Let's talk about the competitor now.
Flexible
Are
dieting.
you guys ready for it?
I love flexible
Let's
dieting.
talk about the flexible diet and what it is. Let's kind of break it down, what that is, and then we can go into other questions about it.
Yeah, so flexible dieting is, it's really in the name. Like I was talking about at the beginning, it's flexible. So as long as you focus on calorie intake and then meeting your macronutrients, everyone's macronutrient intake, so how much protein, how much fat, and how much carbohydrate are you getting, that's going to differ. I do want to say one thing that's really important in flexible dieting that I think a lot of people fail to address is that you can put things into percentages. So you'll hear people say, oh, I'm getting this percentage of fat, this percentage of carbs. And then they'll say this percentage of protein. Protein is not a percentage that you should not be thinking of it that way. The protein that you need is an absolute number, and that should not change no matter how many calories you have. So don't think of it like, 40% of my calorie intake is protein. Well, when you restrict calories and you stick with 40% protein, you're dropping the amount of protein that your body needs to go through protein synthesis to preserve lean body mass. So that should stay as one specific number. No matter what you do, your protein intake should not change.
What is that number?
So that number, if you ask your physician, and what we learned in medical school was 0.8 grams per kilogram. And that is absolutely false. It's bullshit. So that is the absolute minimum. that you need. Like I mentioned before, that is a minimum number. Having less than that, you are in a catabolic state. You're breaking down lean mass. Now, the paper that I mentioned that doubled the protein, got to 1.6 grams per kilogram. They were able to have, proper protein synthesis. But if you increase protein even more, you show greater benefits. A lot of papers suggest going off of lean body mass, so a gram per pound of lean body mass. Really a good number to shoot for is a gram per pound of body weight. It's tough to hit, but
I've tried.
The point at which you get having too much protein, people talk about being harmful, but in order to get to the level of protein that has an impact on your kidneys, you have to eat like 3 times your body weight in grams of protein. That's virtually impossible.
Here's a quick question that within my diet, I do flexible dieting with the time restriction, but that's nor here nor there. But I just want to know, are you supposed to weigh your meat before or after you cook it? Because I've been doing it after, and then somebody told me you're supposed to do it before.
Yeah, do it before, because what you're doing when you're cooking it is you could be adding things like butters and oils and things like that. I wouldn't. So this kind of gets into the fine details of things that people spend so much time thinking about, and instead of thinking about when you measure your food, just be intentional about what you're doing. Because if you measure before and after, I guarantee you're not going to have a different effect personally. It's the differing impact that it's going to make is going to be so minimal that it's not going to change anything. So I'd say just don't worry about it. What's easiest for you? Measuring it before might be easier.
Well, I don't want to put raw chicken on my scale.
But you've got your food already. Don't you want to just eat it, not pour it in a
What do you mean?
bowl and put it on a scale?
Yeah,
I suppose you're going to eat it out of the bowl, huh?
It's, meal prep type thing.
I gotcha. Yeah, do whatever works for you, whatever's easiest.
Okay.
It's not going to make a difference for you.
Sorry to derail you there, but...
No, that's good. Good question.
Let's talk about the pros of flexible dieting.
So flexible dieting addresses the single most important aspect of dieting, and it does this better than any other diet, and that is adherence. So, and this isn't going to be consistent for everybody. Some people, again, we talk about all these different diets and we talk about the pros and cons. Some people respond really well to any diet you pick. You're going to find anecdotal data for anything. But when you don't have to strictly restrict things, it tends to be easier for you. And so flexible dieting, it allows you to focus on the most important things. Macronutrient. Make sure you're getting that macronutrient intake that you need, and make sure that you are not eating excess calories. And when you can focus on those and not worry so much about how you're getting there, it tends to be easier for people. And the problem with getting into restrictive diets, and the reason flexible dieting works so well, is there are papers suggesting that when you go through a more difficult diet, you're more likely to succumb to what's called a disinhibition reflex, which is binge eating. When you do, and this is true especially for myself, and we'll link to a paper that showed it, and this was a rigid versus flexible dieting in non-obese women that they studied. And when you when you start a restricted diet, and then all of a sudden you eat something that is not supposed to be eaten on your diet, like let's say you were doing low carb and low sugar and you had ice cream. Well, what is found in the research is that people who do that end up eating way worse the rest of that day once you eat that, because you're like, well, I've already failed this diet. I'm going to start binge eating other stuff. And you fall into this time and time again. And if you're on a difficult diet where you fail it frequently, you end up binge eating so much more often. And you do not have the ability to restrict certain things anymore because you've fallen into this disinhibition reflex. Compared to flexible dieting, when you look at flexible dieting individuals, they can have that ice cream and it is not going to impact how they eat the rest of the day. You're still more focused on, okay, I'll have this ice cream. That's fine for me, and not feeling like you failed the diet and you can now collapse and then start again tomorrow. And And again, that's been studied, it's been shown. What is important to address, though, with flexible dieting, because some people will do flexible dieting and then just focus on those specific numbers and eat so poorly that it makes it difficult for them. So if you're eating non-nutrient dense foods, highly processed, like foods that like fast food and high sugar
Pizza rolls.
Yeah, stuff that's not actually satiating and it's not going to make you feel full. You're going to start getting hungry more. That'll make flexible dieting really hard for you. If you're not eating healthy foods, then you're basically doing a restricted diet anyways, and it's just as challenging. So it is important to address that if you are doing flexible dieting, because then people will fail flexible dieting if they don't focus on the healthy,
so
nutrient-dense
basically
whole
you can
foods.
eat whatever you want, but you just have to hit those numbers.
Yep, and you want to focus on nutrient-dense
So,
whole
like, let's
foods.
say you go to the Burger King down the road.
Yep.
And you get a Whopper that's 1,000 calories. Now you've only got 1,200 calories left for your day.
Right, and that's how a lot of people will think about it.
Yeah.
And I think that's where people will fail the flexible dieting, though, is when it's like, oh, doesn't matter how I get here as long as I get here. But you still got to hit your macros too.
Yeah.
So you got to figure that out. But if you don't focus on healthy eating, then this tends to be hard.
And then do we see any cons to flexible dieting, or besides like the people falling off and doing binge eating and kind of not sticking with it?
So that's where the like what I was just talking about, the biggest con that I see with flexible dieting is it's hard to sustain because people have a hard time eating those healthier foods that are more satiating and nutrient dense, and when you fall into these like non-nutrient dense, highly processed fast foods that don't really make you feel full, they make you feel hungrier, and you end up having a hard time hitting that calorie goal, then you fail it. And when you fail it, it's hard to get back on it. It's hard to continue it. And then another problem with that is it's hard to count calories. That takes a lot of time out of your day, And so when you've got to count calories and try to figure out, am I hitting my macros and all this stuff, like what that trains you to do is eat consistently, which is a good thing, but you've got to get yourself to get there. And you start to get familiar with, okay, this food is this, and you have an idea. And like for me, I find that I have to eat consistently so that I know, because I don't really like tracking calories, but I do want to know what I'm eating and how many calories and what is the composition of it. And then I'll get into these habits of eating a specific routine throughout the day, and I know if I hit it or if I don't.
Yeah.
And that's what's important for people, like for me personally.
I do the same thing. I literally pretty much the same thing every day.
Yeah, that
It gets boring, but
it helps.
So, Luke, we have done now vegetarian, talked a little bit about flexible dieting. What would you choose between the two?
Yeah, who won the matchup here?
There's bias in this. I do have to report because I myself do flexible dieting. So I do, unlike some nutritional researchers, need to report my bias. I'm picking flexible dieting. I do, however, think that people, I know that people respond well to a vegetarian diet. And if it is something that's easy for you, do it. But I'm picking flexible dieting.
Reed, what would you choose?
Oh, dude, flexible dieting. That was the one I chose right away. I'm like, this one would be easy for me to do myself, and just hitting those macros.
Yeah.
That would be huge. I used to do that with my training clients as well.
I would also go flexible.
FitnessPal. Just mark it down what you're eating.
Yeah.
And you kind of just have a visual.
I use FitnessPal too.
It's an easy free app that you use, and I actually saw a lot of results.
Plug
with my clients.
FitnessPal.
FitnessPal. Yeah, like it was huge.
Second sponsor, Quick Trip.
We're going to make an app for that.
FitnessPal.
But okay, so how I view dieting in people's lives is adherence.
Yeah.
Flexible dieting, time and time again, people can adhere to it much easier if it's not restrictive. When the that You Are What You Eat documentary, people go on plant-based diets, there was an article put out from Stanford where they went and interviewed every single participant in that study, so 22 sets of twins, And not one of them sustained that vegan diet. They admitted that it helped them be more conscious of their foods, but they weren't able to sustain it. Not a single one of them. And the documentary highlights like, oh, this is the best diet in the world. But yeah, I mean, I think adherence is the most important thing.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, consistency is key.
Right.
Keeps you going. I also choose flexible. I don't know if you heard that. I also do it.
Yeah. Analysis is paralysis, you guys. Don't focus on these fine little details of should I measure before or after I cook my food. Focus on what you know is helping you. Spend less time worrying about all the fine details, and you will be happy with the outcome.
Do what's easiest for you, for sure.
And again, in the comments section, tell us what you would do.
Yeah, what would you do? Flexible dieting? Vegetarian?
Yeah.
I want to hear from you vegetarians, too.
Thanks for tuning in. Thanks again for tuning in to the Kickback Science Podcast. We love talking science with all of you, and if you feel the same, you can support us by subscribing, hitting that like button, and giving us a follow on our social media pages. Don't forget, you can submit questions through our website and in the comments section of all our social media. Have a good one, everyone.